A stranger knocked during the blizzard. She let her in. At dawn, a millionaire revealed the truth. That's how her quiet life unraveled. With one shivering woman on her porch and a choice made in the kind of cold that tests a person's soul. She thought she was offering shelter for a single night. She didn't know the storm had brought something deeper. Something that had been looking for her name for years. Snow had a way of slowing the world into honesty. It muted the noise, softened the angles, and forced people to look at what they'd been ignoring. On the night it began, the flakes fell in a thick, whispering curtain outside Evelyn Hart's cabin, turning the valley into a white breath. She stood by the window with one hand on the sill, watching the storm build like a memory she didn't ask for. Her cabin sat on the farthest edge of Maple Hollow, past the last mailbox, past the old mill, tucked at the foot of a hill that winter swallowed first each year. She chose this spot for the quiet, long before she knew what loneliness could do to someone. The walls held stories but none that spoke back. She kept busy with work from the library, cataloging old maps and forgotten records, but most nights ended the same. A cup of tea cooling beside her, a book she pretended to read, and the weight of the silence settling like another snowfall. She lived simply. Not out of virtue but out of habit. A woman who once lived in the city, who once believed life could be rearranged into something predictable, now found comfort in routines that didn't demand much. She made soup in batches, kept blankets folded in a cedar chest, and paid attention to the weather as though it were an old friend with moods she could read. The storm wasn't unexpected. What it carried was, by 9 the wind had begun pushing against the windows, rattling the hinges. Evelyn lit the remaining candles, more for company than necessity. The power lines in this part of town bowed easily under ice, and she'd learned to welcome the kind of darkness that reminded her she could still adapt. She was reaching for another match when the sound arrived. 3 knocks. Soft, spaced, uncertain. They didn't belong to this hour. They didn't belong to this storm. They didn't belong to her life. For a long breath she didn't move. The knocking came again, a little weaker, as if the night itself had brought someone to her doorstep. She stepped toward the door, feeling the cold slip through the wood. When she pulled it open, the wind rushed in first, carrying flakes that clung to her hair and scattered across the floor. Then she saw her. An old woman, small in frame, wrapped in a coat that looked older than the storm. Her gray hair clung to her forehead in damp strands, and her eyes, pale, frantic, searching, locked onto Evelyn with both fear and hope. "Please," the woman whispered. Just that one word. The kind a person speaks when they're not asking for much, only to not be left outside the way the world has already left them. Evelyn's heart moved before her voice did. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. The woman crossed the threshold with slow, trembling steps, leaving a trail of melting snow behind her. When Evelyn shut the door, the cabin swallowed the wind's roar, trading it for the thin, uneven breathing of her guest. She helped her out of her coat, soaked, heavy, trembling. Underneath was a faded sweater, patched in places, carrying the scent of cold air and long walks. "Sit by the fire," Evelyn said, guiding her gently. The woman warmed her hands near the flames, her fingers thin as twigs. Evelyn noticed the way she held them, carefully, like someone who had learned not to expect warmth often. She brought her a blanket, then a cup of ginger tea, the one she'd brewed minutes earlier. When the woman wrapped both hands around the mug, her shoulders loosened slightly, as though the heat was persuading her to trust the room. "What were you doing out there?" Evelyn asked softly. There was a pause, long enough to hear the pine crackle in the fire. "I lost my way," the woman murmured. "The storm came faster than I thought." "Where were you headed?" The woman hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the mug. I'm not sure anymore." Evelyn didn't push. Some truths needed time before they could be spoken without breaking. Instead, she brought out her spare slippers and handed them over. The woman accepted them with a nod, as if the small act carried a meaning Evelyn couldn't yet see. Hours passed in a quiet that wasn't empty. The woman asked no questions, made no demands. She sat by the fire as though she'd been searching for one her whole life. Evelyn found herself studying the features softened by age, the fine lines, the faint scar under her left cheek, the silver hair that caught the firelight like threads of frost. She didn't look like someone who belonged to Maple Hollow. She didn't look like someone who should have been walking alone in a storm. When midnight came, Evelyn set up the guest room with fresh sheets, smoothing the corners the way her mother used to. The woman walked in slowly, pausing at the doorway, something about the room pulling at her. She traced her fingers lightly along the dresser, over the wooden edge carved with tiny stars. A small smile touched her lips, brief, almost secret. "You're very kind," she said. "It's just one night," Evelyn replied. "Sometimes, one night changes more than people think." Evelyn didn't know what to say to that. So she simply nodded and wished her a good night. The woman lay down as though her body had been waiting for this bed for years. Back in the living room, Evelyn extinguished the last candle and sat on the couch, listening to the storm claw at the windows. She tried to read, but her thoughts kept circling back to the stranger in the next room. Something about her presence stirred an old ache, the kind that comes when life hands you a moment that feels heavier than it should. She wondered if she should have asked more questions. She wondered if this choice would bring trouble. But beneath every worry was a quiet truth. She couldn't have left the woman outside. Sometimes kindness doesn't wait for logic. It moves because it must. As the storm raged on, Evelyn drifted into a restless sleep, the kind that hovers between dreams and memory. She heard footsteps in the night, light, careful ones, and for a moment she thought the woman was wandering the cabin. But when she opened her eyes, the house was still. Morning arrived gray and heavy, with snow piled high against the windows. The storm had stopped, but the world outside lay reshaped, blanketed, almost erased. Evelyn wrapped her shawl tighter and walked toward the guest room, ready to check on the woman. The door was open. The bed was neatly made. The slippers she'd given were aligned perfectly under the chair. The room was empty. Evelyn felt a strange pull in her chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was the feeling you get when something ends before you understand why it began. She stepped into the room, scanning the quiet. On the pillow lay a small folded note. There was no name, no signature, just a sentence written in faint, shaky handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me." Evelyn held the note for a long moment, unsure why her eyes stung. She set it gently on the dresser, not knowing that before the sun touched the ridge, a stranger would arrive at her door. Not old, not lost, not fragile, but a man whose presence would shift the breath of the room. And with him, the truth that would rewrite everything she thought she understood about last night. For a while she stood in the doorway of the empty guest room, as if the old woman might reappear if she stared long enough. The bedspread's smoothness felt deliberate. The pillow bore no dent, no trace of sleep. It was as if the night had folded itself back up and walked away. The note between her fingers weighed less than it should. "Thank you for seeing me." 7 words that shouldn't have lodged themselves in her throat, but did. It occurred to her that being seen was something people claimed they wanted but rarely offered to others. Evelyn had built an entire life around not being noticed, and yet last night she had opened the door without thinking. She went through the small, practical motions of mourning because that is what people do when something feels unreal. She put the kettle on. She cracked 2 eggs into a pan and watched them sizzle. Outside, Maple Hollow was still buried, the road invisible beneath the smooth, pale sweep of snow. The trees stood like witnesses in white coats. Her phone on the counter remained silent. No alerts from the town, no messages from the council. If there had been a missing person, surely someone would have called. She thought of dialing the sheriff anyway, but the idea tangled with something else, a reluctance to explain a night that already sounded made up. There was a storm. An old woman knocked. I let her in. She left before sunrise. It wasn't a crime. It wasn't even a story you could report. It was simply an answer she had chosen in the dark. After breakfast she pulled on her boots and heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and opened the front door to the bright, cold aftermath. The sky had turned a hard blue, as if the storm's outburst had scrubbed it clean. Light bounced off every surface, almost too much for the eyes. On the porch, the snow bore evidence of the night. 2 sets of footprints leading to the house, half filled by the fresh fall. But from the door outward, only one set led away, small and straight, heading down the path and then vanishing where the drift grew deeper. No hesitation at the steps, no wandering circle of someone lost. It was the walk of a person who knew exactly where they meant to go. Evelyn followed the trail with her gaze until it disappeared into the glare. The urge to go after it tugged at her like a thread, but reason answered. The roads weren't cleared yet, The drifts could swallow her to the knees. The town was used to taking its time after a storm. She had responsibilities, even if they were just to the quiet library that depended on her to keep its records in order. She went back inside, brushing snow from her sleeves, and glanced once more at the guest room. The slippers still sat neatly under the chair. For reasons she couldn't name, she didn't move them. At 10:30, the plow finally rumbled past her cabin, leaving a narrow cut through the white. The sound felt like the world reasserting itself, the familiar machinery of routine throwing a rope over the night and dragging it into the ordinary. She washed the dishes, wiped the counters, and tried not to read too much into a sense of unfinishedness that hovered over the morning like low fog. By noon, the sky had settled into a pale brightness and the day seemed to be deciding nothing unusual had happened. Evelyn stood at the window again, watching the sun sink weakly toward the tree line. The cabin, with its worn furniture and the faint scent of wood smoke, had never felt more like a small island floating in something vast. The knock came again. 3 knocks. Not soft, not hesitant this time. Measured, controlled. The sound of someone who knew his own presence and had never had a door closed in his face. Every muscle in her body tightened, the memory of the night before colliding with the present. She wiped her hands on her jeans, crossed the room and opened the door. The man on her step did not belong to Maple Hollow. He stood tall against the cold, wrapped in a dark coat that fit him with the quiet precision of something tailored and expensive. Snow dusted his shoulders, melting quickly against wool that didn't seem to know discomfort. His hair was streaked with early gray at the temples, not from neglect but from years that had clearly been full. His shoes were polished in a way snow usually punishes, and yet they'd survived the walk from a vehicle she couldn't see beyond the curve of the drive. But it was his eyes that held her, the color of old glass, sharp and assessing, carrying a kind of tiredness that money doesn't erase. For a second, neither of them spoke. The winter air moved between them like a third presence. "Miss Hart?" he asked at last, his voice low, educated, carrying a city that didn't belong to these mountains. "Yes," she said slowly. He nodded once, as if a fact had just been confirmed. "My name is Daniel Mercer." The name pulled at something distant in her memory. A headline glimpsed, a news segment half heard in the background. He stood there without introducing what he was, and yet everything about him introduced it anyway. The posture of decision, the subtle impatience in his jaw, the way he wore his coat like armor and uniform both. "May I come in for a moment?" he added. "I believe someone spent the night here." She felt the cabin behind her, the note on the dresser, the slippers under the chair. The instinct to protect her space flared, but so did something else. The awareness that he hadn't come out this far in a storm without reason. "You're looking for an older woman," she said. For the first time, his gaze shifted, and something in his expression softened. "Yes," he replied. "I am." Evelyn stepped aside. "Come in." The cold followed him briefly before the door shut it out. He took in the small living room and a scan it probably couldn't help but make. Fireplace, bookshelf, lamp, the photo of her parents on the side table. His presence seemed to shrink the space, not by force but by density. He carried decisions with him the way others carried worry. "She was here," Evelyn said, moving toward the fireplace. "She came during the storm. I gave her the guest room. This morning she was gone." He listened without interrupting, his gaze returning to her face as if measuring not just her words but the way she held them. When she finished, he let out a breath he might not have known he'd been holding. "Did she tell you her name?" he asked. "No," Evelyn said. "I didn't ask." He paused, and in that pause there was something like surprise. At her restraint, perhaps, or at the fact that someone had accepted the woman without needing the usual credentials. "So you let a stranger into your home in the middle of a blizzard," he said quietly, stating a fact, not a rebuke. "And never asked who she was." "She was freezing," Evelyn replied. "Sometimes the details can wait." For a heartbeat, something like respect flickered in his eyes. Passed quickly, replaced by an intent focus. He glanced toward the hallway. "May I see the room where she stayed?" Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. She led him down the short corridor, feeling oddly self-conscious about the simple walls and the thin rug. He stepped into the guest room and paused, his gaze catching on the bed, the chair, the small dresser with its carved stars. He walked to the dresser like a man stepping into a memory. His hand rested briefly on the wood, fingers tracing a groove worn by years. From this angle, Evelyn could see his face clearly. Beneath the composed surface, a storm of his own seemed to be passing, something raw and private. She made the bed, Evelyn said softly, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something fragile. He nodded, eyes distant. She always did, he murmured. The words hung between them, full of meanings Evelyn couldn't reach. He noticed the folded note on the pillow then, and his expression sharpened. May I? He asked. It's addressed to no one, Evelyn replied. She left it behind. He picked it up carefully as though the paper might crumble. When he read the 7 words, his face altered, not dramatically, but in the quiet way of a person who has just been struck somewhere old inside. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for seeing me. His jaw tightened. His fingers pressed slightly into the page. For a moment he looked older than when he'd arrived, not in years but in accounting. People who keep ledgers in their minds recognize certain kinds of debt instantly. She wrote this? Evelyn asked. Yes, he said, voice low. She did. You know her. It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. Very well, he said. And nowhere near well enough. He set the note back exactly where he'd found it, as if refusing to change the small decision the woman had made in leaving it behind. When he turned back to Evelyn, the professional composure, the bearing of a man accustomed to controlling rooms, was still there, but now there was something else layered beneath it. Vulnerability reluctantly acknowledged. You said she left before you woke? He asked. Before dawn, I think, Evelyn replied. I heard footsteps in the night. I found her slippers there, the bed made, and that note. There were tracks leading from the house to the road, but they disappeared into the drifts. He considered this, eyes narrowing slightly as he calculated distances, temperatures, risk. It was an old habit, the mind of someone who had built his life on the math of outcomes. Yet there was a softness to his concern that didn't match the corporate sharpness in his suit. Did she seem confused? He asked. Lost. Evelyn thought back to the way the woman had traced the dresser, the way her eyes had moved around the room like someone reacquainting themselves with a dream. She knew how to hold a cup and find the fire, she said. But when I asked where she was headed, she said she wasn't sure anymore. He absorbed that in silence. A restless muscle ticked once in his cheek. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly, as if he'd set down an invisible briefcase and picked up something heavier. My mother has a talent for disappearing, he said quietly. The word hung in the room like a bell. Mother. Evelyn blinked. The old woman's slight frame, the worn coat, the weary eyes now rearranged themselves under that new light. She is your mother? Yes, he replied. Margaret Mercer. The name unrolled history in the air, even for someone who didn't know the details. Mercer. Evelyn had heard it on the radio, seen it in headlines tucked into the corners of her phone screen. Real estate. Investments. A man who'd rebuilt neighborhoods. A family that donated wings to hospitals and wrote checks with too many zeros for ordinary people to imagine. She had never connected those distant stories to the woman warming her hands by Evelyn's fire. You drove out here in a blizzard for her, Evelyn said. I flew in last night, he answered simply. Drove this morning as soon as the roads allowed. The facility called. She walked out before the storm truly began. The word facility sat uneasily in the room, rubbing against the memory of slippers aligned under a chair. She seemed clear enough, Evelyn said, almost defensively, as though she owed the old woman protection. Gentle. Tired but not broken. He watched her as she spoke, and in that look there was a quiet, aching gratitude she couldn't quite name. You gave her something most places can't, he said. Not a room. A choice. She wasn't sure what to do with that. It made her think of the way Margaret had stood in the doorway of the guest room, fingers brushing the carved stars, eyes soft with some private recognition. It made her think of the line on the pillow, thank you for seeing me. You said facility, Evelyn murmured. Is she ill? He didn't flinch away from the question, though she saw the shadow it cast across his features. She has good days and bad days, he replied. Lately more of the latter. Name slip. Times blur. Places rearrange themselves in her mind. But some paths, it seems, she can still follow in a storm. His gaze went back to the dresser. She grew up in a town like this. Not here but close enough. She raised me in a 2-room apartment above a hard. No storms, no blizzards, just a constant hustle of survival. I spent my life trying to build something so she would never have to be cold again. He gave a small, humorless smile. And yet here we are. Evelyn felt something in her chest respond, a familiar ache for promises made to parents, the kind that grow heavier with age. She thought of her own mother's hands, callous from decades at the diner, and the way she had once said, half joking, half serious, "Just promise me you'll live somewhere warm when you're old. Somewhere with soft chairs and no leaky roofs." Her mother had died before roofs and chairs could be upgraded. Grief had driven Evelyn out here, to a cabin she'd intended to share with a future that never quite arrived. She had thought she'd closed the door on other people's storms. The man in front of her was proof that storms knew how to find those doors anyway. "Why here?" she asked quietly. "How did you know to come to this cabin?" He reached into his coat pocket then, pulling out something she hadn't expected, a small creased photograph, edges worn, colors faded into the soft pastels of time. He held it out to her. She took it carefully. The image showed the front of her cabin, or something that looked very much like it, years ago, before the paint had weathered, before the trees had grown so tall. On the porch stood a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes, holding a baby on her hip. Beside her, an older woman leaned against the railing, laughter visible in the crinkling of her face. The younger woman was a stranger to Evelyn. The older one was not. It was Margaret, decades younger, with less gray and more world in front of her. But the eyes, the tilt of the chin, the way she held herself against the wind were unmistakable. "This cabin belonged to the Whitcombs before you," Daniel said. "My mother worked here one winter, when I was just a baby, helping the family through a difficult season. She used to tell me stories about the house at the edge of the world. I thought house at the edge of the world. I thought it was a child's name for a place that never really existed." He nodded toward the photograph. "When she began slipping, she talked about it more. I didn't listen. I was busy building everything else. Last week she showed me that picture. Said she wanted to go back just once, to the place someone let her in when no one else would. I told her we'd visit in the spring, when the roads were clear." She nodded, but her eyes, they didn't agree. He exhaled, looking around the room, this very room. "And then last night, she walked out into a storm and ended up exactly where she'd been trying to get to for years." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the photograph. The two women on the porch seemed to watch her from across time, their faces full of a moment she would never fully know. "So she found this cabin by memory," she said. "Or by something stronger," he replied. "Some places live under the skin. They call us back when logic says we shouldn't be able to hear them." He looked at Evelyn then with a new kind of focus. "The Whitcombs sold this property 15 years ago, according to the records. To you." "Yes," she said slowly. "After my mother died, I needed to leave the city. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere no one knew me. I saw the listing in a paper that wasn't even from my county. It felt random." "Nothing about that is random," he murmured. She almost laughed at that. "Sometimes people just run away and end up where the bus stops," she said. "Sometimes," he agreed. "And sometimes they end up exactly where someone else once survived." The room felt smaller now, the story widening around them. Outside, the snow glittered, indifferent and bright. Inside, a man who had more money than most small nations stood in a cabin warmed by a woman who counted coupons and stacked wood herself. Evelyn folded the photograph along its old crease and handed it back. His fingers brushed hers as he took it, a brief contact that carried a current of recognition, not of each other, but of a shared understanding. Life rarely unfolds according to the plans of those who think they are in charge. "Why did she leave?" Evelyn asked quietly. "If this place meant so much, if she came all this way in that storm, why not stay until you arrived?" He looked at the note on the pillow again. "Because staying has always been harder for her than leaving," he said. "And because I think last night she needed something I've never quite known how to give her." He turned back to Evelyn, his voice softening. She needed someone to see her without knowing anything about her. No history. No headlines. No mistakes. Just a woman knocking in the cold. Evelyn felt heat rise behind her eyes. The note's words pulsed gently in the silence. "Thank you for seeing me. She doesn't remember my father most days," Daniel continued. She doesn't remember the early years when we had nothing but still laughed over burnt pancakes. But she remembered this house. Whoever opened the door back then left a mark that outlasted everything else. And last night, you did the same thing. She shook her head slightly. I just opened a door. He gave a small, tired smile. For some people, that is the difference between being alive and merely surviving. In the living room, the kettle began to hiss faintly on the stove. Time, which had been stretching and pausing in odd ways since the storm, clicked forward again. Evelyn became aware of her own heartbeat, of the thinness of her socks inside her boots, of the weight of the man's gaze as if he were trying to decide something that reached beyond the usual calculations of his world. I don't know where she is now, Evelyn said. I don't know if she's heading toward an old address or just following a feeling, but she didn't seem frightened here. She seemed at rest. He looked at her, and for the first time since he'd arrived, something like relief eased his shoulders. Then whatever comes next, he said slowly, I am already in your debt. Already in your debt. The word debt sounded different from his mouth than it did in the mouths of men in suits on television. It sounded personal, exact, as if he understood the value of what had been given better than the one who had given it. Evelyn didn't know what to say to that. She'd spent years building a life where no one owed her anything, and she owed no one more than her work and her rent. The idea that a man like this believed he owed her something for one night of kindness felt absurd. He reached into his coat again, and instinctively she tensed, half expecting a business card, a thick envelope, some gesture that would try to turn last night into a transaction. Instead, he pulled out a leather wallet, simple, worn at the edges. From it he drew a small card, not glossy, not emblazoned with a logo. It carried only his name, a phone number, and an address in a city she would likely never visit. If you ever hear from her again, he said, offering it to her, if she comes back or calls or leaves another note, will you contact me? She looked down at the card. The name was printed in clean, unassuming letters. Daniel Mercer. Below it, nothing about titles or companies. Just an address, a number, a line of ink connecting her cabin to a world of glass towers and boardrooms. Yes, she said quietly. I will. She took the card, feeling the weight of it settle between her fingers. In that moment something shifted, subtle but profound. The cabin, the snow, the quiet of her life, all rearranged themselves around a new possibility she couldn't yet see. Outside, a crow called from a branch, black against white, as if punctuating an unseen sentence. Evelyn slipped the card into the pocket of her sweater, not knowing that this simple act of placement would be the first small movement in a chain of decisions that would carry her far beyond Maple Hollow. Not knowing that the storm had not just brought her a stranger needing warmth, but a thread that, when pulled, would unravel the life she'd carefully wrapped around herself. For now, there was only a man in her guest room, a note on a pillow, and a morning that looked ordinary from the outside but was already different in a way the rest of the town would not understand. She walked him back to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob, the cold pressing faintly through the wood. Thank you, he said again, this time without the practiced politeness of habit. For opening the door. For not asking for a name before you decided. She met his gaze, feeling the sincerity there. You're welcome, she replied. Whoever she was when she knocked, she was just someone who didn't deserve to be left out in the cold. He held her eyes for a moment longer, then nodded, as if committing something about her to memory. When he stepped out onto the porch, the winter light caught his profile, carving it into something both resolute and unexpectedly fragile. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Evelyn stood there for a few seconds, hand still on the knob, listening to the muffled crunch of his footsteps receding into the snow. Somewhere beyond the bend in the road, a car door would open, an engine would start, and a man used to controlling outcomes would drive away from the one place his mother had found on her own. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled. The note on the pillow waited. And in the quiet that followed his departure, Evelyn Hart felt, for the first time in a very long while, that her life had been noticed by someone other than herself. She didn't yet know that notice is a kind of doorway too, and that what had just stepped through hers would not be leaving as quickly as it seemed. For the rest of the day, the cabin felt like it had swallowed an echo and didn't quite know what to do with it. Evelyn moved through her chores, but the morning clung to her like the smell of smoke after a fire. She refolded the blanket in the guest room twice, knowing no one would use it that night. She straightened a picture frame that hadn't been crooked. She opened the pantry, stared at the shelves, and closed it again without taking anything out. Everywhere she looked, there were reminders of the woman who had slipped in and out of her life between one storm and the next. The slippers under the chair. The faint indent in the rug where the suitcase had not been. The note on the pillow, its ink already the color of memory. She picked it up once more. "Thank you for seeing me." The words were quiet, but they rearranged the air around them. She thought of how many faces she'd looked at over the years without really registering them. The cashier behind the grocery counter whose name tag she never read. The mechanic who fixed her old truck every winter and talked about carburetors like they were family. The kids at the library drifting between shelves, their lives threaded with noise she didn't know. Seeing someone she realized was different from noticing they existed. Last night, she hadn't tried to do either. She just opened a door. By late afternoon, she forced herself into her usual routine. The library wouldn't wait for her to untangle the meaning of 7 words. The town still needed someone to make sure its history didn't slip into the cracks between years. She pulled on her coat and drove slowly into Maple Hollow, the truck's tires crunching over the packed snow. The sky had gone the color of steel, clouds gathering again in the distance like thoughts that hadn't finished forming. On Main Street, the plow had carved a path between banks of snow taller than the fire hydrants. The bakery's windows glowed warm, condensation painting soft, ghostly shapes from the inside. Inside the library, the air smelled faintly of dust and old paper and the lemon oil she used on the shelves. The heater rattled the way it always did, complaining quietly but still working. She flipped the sign from closed to open, even though she knew traffic would be thin. Snow days made people choose between warmth and errands. Most chose warmth. The first hour passed in silence, broken only by the occasional turning of a page as she reshelved returns. She welcomed the familiar sounds. The thunk of a hardcover sliding home. The soft scratch of her pen as she jotted notes in the margin of the inventory log. Her hands knew these motions as well as they knew the shape of a mug or the weight of firewood. It was almost 3 when the bell over the door chimed. She looked up, half expecting a teenager seeking refuge from boredom or Mrs. Calloway from the post office, who liked to borrow romance novels and pretend they were for her sister. Instead, a deliveryman stepped in, stomping snow from his boots, arms wrapped around a medium-sized package. "Afternoon, Evelyn," he said, shaking cold from his cap. "Storm didn't scare you off work, huh?" She managed a small smile. "Books don't shovel themselves," she replied. He chuckled and nodded toward the box. "Got something for you. Came in under priority courier, which is unusual for our little corner of nowhere. No return address, but they paid good money to have it here today." He set the box on the front desk with a soft thud. The cardboard was new, the edges clean, a crispness that didn't match the rest of the town's battered parcels. A single white label bore her name printed neatly. "Just this?" she asked. "Just that," he said. "They made me sign more forms than when old Mr. Hanley got his oxygen machine. Whatever's in there, someone wants you to have it quick." Her stomach gave a small, inexplicable twist. "Thanks, Mark." He tipped his cap and left, the bell chiming again as the door closed behind him. Snow swirled briefly in the gap and then settled. For a long moment, Evelyn simply looked at the box. She was not a woman who received surprises. Bills, flyers, the occasional postcard from a college friend who forgot she disliked beaches, those were the things that found their way to her. Not priority packages in tidy cardboard. Finally, she reached for a letter opener and slit the tape. The flaps lifted with a dryer opener and slit the tape. The flaps lifted with a dry rip, revealing careful packing paper. She folded it back. Inside was a simple wooden frame wrapped in tissue. She unwrapped it, and the breath went out of her chest. The photograph inside was the same one she had held that morning, her cabin as it once was, a younger Margaret leaning on the railing, a dark-haired woman holding a baby. But this version had been restored. The colors were clearer, the edges sharpened. The wood of the porch looked almost sun-warm, the sky a soft, promising blue. Someone had taken the time to bring the image back from the edge of fading. Beneath the glass at the bottom of the photo, a small plaque had been attached. The letters were understated, engraved into brass. "House at the edge of the world." Maple Hollow, winter 1985. There was a slim envelope taped to the back of the frame. Her name was written on it in the same neat handwriting as the shipping label. She pried it free and opened it with fingers that weren't as steady as she would have liked. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper. Ms. Hart, thank you again for caring for my mother last night. There are moments in a person's life when they are carried, briefly, by the kindness of strangers. You now belong to two such moments in hers. The photograph you saw this morning has been in a box for years. I had it restored some time ago without quite knowing why. Now I do. It belongs in that house with someone who understands what it means to open a door for no reason other than it is the right thing to do. Consider this a small attempt to return a piece of the story you stepped into. I cannot promise you that my mother will not wander again. I can only promise that, should her path ever bring her back to your door, I will come when you call. With respect, Daniel Mercer. At the bottom, written in a different pen, smaller and less sure, were 3 additional words, added off-center as if someone had leaned in after the letter was finished. Thank you to. No signature. No shaky M for Margaret. Just the echo of someone's insistence that gratitude be shared. Evelyn stared at those 3 words until they blurred. She blinked hard, then set the letter down and looked again at the photograph. 2 women on a porch, one young, one older, the baby's fist stuffed into its own mouth. The younger woman gazed at the camera with a kind of determined joy. The older one threw her head back, caught mid-laugh, as if whoever took the photo had said something funny right before pressing the shutter. Do you know who she is? Evelyn had asked that morning, pointing to the younger woman. I've never met her, Daniel had replied. But my mother says she saved us that winter. Evelyn traced the edge of the frame with her thumb. It felt like holding proof that the cabin's story stretched further back than her own grief-driven escape. It had been a refuge long before she arrived, its door opening in storms she had never seen. She propped the frame against a stack of books on the counter and tried to return to her tasks. But each time she glanced up, the past looked back at her. After a while, work became an exercise in rearranging shelves she'd already arranged. The list of things to be done dissolved under the weight of something more pressing, the sense that whatever had begun in the night was not finished with her. An hour before closing, the phone rang. She picked it up automatically. Maple Hollow Public Library, she said. Miss Hart, a voice replied. Female, crisp, professional. The kind of tone that had been trained not to waste syllables. Yes. Who's calling? This is Claire Hastings, the woman said. I'm Mr. Mercer's assistant. The shift from Daniel on the letter to Mr. Mercer on the phone bridged the distance between the man who'd stood in her guest room and the world he belonged to. I hope I'm not disturbing you, Claire continued. Mr. Mercer asked me to follow up on the delivery. Has it arrived? It has, Evelyn said. The photograph. And the letter. Good, Claire said, and there was a hint of warmth under the efficiency. He wanted to make sure it reached you today. Our side of the state was buried in the same storm, and the courier company had a meltdown. I didn't expect, Evelyn began, then trailed off, uncertain how to finish. You didn't expect a frame and a thank you, Claire supplied gently. Or a billionaire on your porch, I imagine. Evelyn blinked. The word sounded somehow vulgar in the context of her small town. Billionaire. I don't really think in those numbers, she said at last. Few people do, Claire replied. Mr. Mercer is unusual in that sense. There was a small pause, as if Claire were weighing how much she was allowed to say. He also asked me to extend an invitation. Evelyn's hand tightened around the receiver. An invitation? Yes, Claire said. To the city. He'll be hosting a private dinner next week. Just a small gathering. He would like you to attend as his guest. Evelyn almost laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that startled even her. She sat down, suddenly aware of the old swivel chair beneath her and the sagging cushion that always leaned slightly to the left. You're inviting me to dinner, she said slowly, because I opened my door in a storm. We're inviting you, Claire replied, because last night you were part of a story that matters a great deal to him, and because he believes there are things best said in person. I have work, Evelyn said automatically. The library. The dates are flexible, Claire interrupted, though kindly. We can arrange transportation and accommodation. You wouldn't have to worry about expenses. It would be a quick trip. In on Thursday, back by Saturday. Evelyn looked around the empty library. One old man dozed in the reading corner, his newspaper folded over his chest. A teen at the back table scrolled his phone, earbuds in, the untouched textbook open like a prop. The heater rattled again, doggedly pumping warmth into a room that held more books than people. "I'm not sure I belong at a dinner like that," she admitted. "Ms. Hart," Claire said, and there was something firmer in her tone now, a practiced authority that made people reconsider their excuses. "I think for once the question is not where you belong, but where you've already arrived. You didn't ask to be pulled into the Mercer family's orbit, but here you are. This is simply a chance to understand the gravity of what you did. And perhaps," she hesitated, then continued, "perhaps to hear a little more about the house you live in." That caught Evelyn off guard. "What do you mean?" "Mr. Mercer has been looking into its history all morning," Claire said. "Apparently, this cabin has been quietly inserting itself into his mother's life for decades. He thinks it's time someone actually listened to why." The clock on the wall ticked, each second a small nudge. Evelyn felt as though she were standing at the edge of a familiar road that had suddenly split into two. One path led back to her usual days, plowing through cataloging tasks, chopping firewood, nodding to neighbors at the market. The other led to unknown rooms and conversations she wasn't sure how to navigate. Maple Hollow didn't often export its people to glass towers and quiet, private dinners. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course," Claire said. "But we need to confirm arrangements by Monday. I'll send you an email with the details." "There's no obligation, Ms. Hart. Just an open door in the other direction this time." After she hung up, the library felt too small. She finished her shift on autopilot, the motions of closing practiced into muscle memory. Flip the sign. Lock the doors. Check the windows. Turn the heater down but not off. When she stepped back outside, the sky had deepened into that early evening blue that only existed in winter, a color between day and night. On the drive back, she took the long route along the ridge. The snow lay unbroken in the fields, smooth and serene. Smoke curled from chimneys. Dogs bounded in the distance, ecstatic at the new landscape. The world looked content to stay ordered as it had always been. But inside Evelyn, something had shifted, like a book nudged out of alignment on a shelf that had been perfect for years. At home, she set the framed photograph on the mantel above the fireplace. It looked like it had been waiting there all along. The women in the picture stared out at the room, unbothered by the years that had stacked between their moment and this one. She made herself a bowl of soup, more out of duty than appetite, and ate it standing up. Her mind kept jumping ahead to rooms she'd never seen. Linen-covered tables. Soft lighting. People whose forks never scraped their plates. She imagined herself in her one decent dress, tugging self-consciously at the hem while conversations flowed around her in a language she didn't quite speak. "What would I even say to them?" she murmured aloud, startling herself. No answer came, of course. The cabin held its silence with its usual politeness. She reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out Daniel's card, smoothing it on the table. The name. The number. The address that belonged in a part of the city where people like her usually only went in books. On its own, the card meant little. Combined with the frame, the note, the invitation, it felt like a hand extended across a distance she had told herself she was content never to cross. She tried to imagine her mother's reaction. "Go," the memory of her voice said, clear as if she were leaning against the counter again, drying dishes. "If someone opens a door for you, at least go stand in the doorway. You can always step back. But don't die wondering what was on the other side." Her mother had rarely traveled farther than the next county, but she had believed in curiosity the way some people believed in saints. Evelyn slept badly that night, dreams weaving city lights into snowbanks, Margaret's lined face into the faces of strangers in formal wear. In one dream, the old woman stood on her porch again, not shivering this time but smiling, as if satisfied with the choices being made in her absence. By morning, she had almost convinced herself to decline. The library needed her. The truck might not handle the freeway. She didn't own shoes that didn't squeak in fancy rooms. Then she opened her email. The subject line waited there. Invitation, Mercer dinner and travel arrangements. She clicked. The body of the message was practical to the point of kindness. Travel times that didn't require dawn departures. A hotel near the venue, modest by Mercer standards but more luxurious than anything she'd ever stayed in. A car service was arranged so she wouldn't have to navigate unfamiliar streets. At the bottom, beneath Claire's signature, a short postscript in a different font. P.S. My mother would like very much to see you again if you're willing. Her words, not mine. Evelyn's hand hovered over the keys. Decline. Accept. Ignore. She thought of Margaret's hands hovering above the fire, as if measuring warmth. Of the way she had looked at the guest room as though walking into her own past. Of the note on the pillow, the gratitude stitched between shaky lines. Then she thought of the life she'd built from careful avoidance. The friends she kept at arm's length. The opportunities she'd let pass because they might demand more of her than she thought she had to give. She began to type. Thank you for the invitation. I will come. Her finger hesitated above the send button only once. Then she clicked. The message whooshed away, and with it, the version of herself who had never left Maple Hollow for anything that wasn't an emergency or a funeral. When she went to the mantel that evening, the women in the photograph seemed to be watching her differently. The younger one's smile looked almost conspiratorial. The older one's laugh appeared mid-approval. You two started this, Evelyn muttered. The fire crackled in agreement. Outside, another small storm had begun, flakes turning the night soft. Inside, a woman who had always believed her story would be written in the language of quiet cabins and modest days, now found a new chapter being offered in the handwriting of a man whose life had been defined by scale. She didn't yet know that the city would not simply be a place she visited and left behind. That rooms filled with money would reveal emptiness she recognized, and that her presence in those rooms would do more than receive explanations. She only knew that a door had opened, and this time, she was the one stepping through into someone else's storm. The drive into the city felt like moving between two different versions of the world, one where breath rose in small clouds over snowbanks, and another where glass towers pierced the sky as if daring the sun to look away. Evelyn sat in the back of the car service sedan, fingers laced in her lap, watching the landscape shift through the window. Maple Hollow's white silence slowly gave way to wider roads, heavier traffic, and buildings pressed shoulder to shoulder like people in a crowded room. She had packed lightly, a navy dress she hadn't worn since her cousin's wedding, a sweater that felt safe, and the framed photograph wrapped in a towel, tucked carefully into her suitcase. She didn't know why she brought it, only that leaving it behind felt wrong, as if the cabin needed her to carry one part of its story with her. The city grew larger until it felt like it was leaning in, curious about the woman staring at it with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Her heart beat in a rhythm she didn't recognize. Not fear. Not exactly excitement. Something in between, something like standing at the top of a ridge and knowing the ground beneath you was about to change. The car turned onto a quieter street, where the buildings exhaled a little and trees lined the sidewalks. The hotel rose above them, elegant without bragging about it. Light glowed warmly from its lobby windows, and the doorman greeted the approaching car as if he'd been waiting specifically for her. The driver opened her door. Here you are, Miss Hart. She nodded, clutching her bag a little tighter as she stepped out. Inside, the lobby was all soft lighting and polished stone, the kind of place designed to make people forget the world could be harsh. A woman at the front desk welcomed her with a practiced smile, handed her a key card, and gave directions to the elevator with a courtesy that felt almost unreal. Her room on the 12th floor overlooked the skyline. She set her bag down slowly, absorbing the quiet hum of climate control, the smoothness of the comforter, the faint scent of fresh linen. It felt like stepping into someone else's life. A life that had not once been shaped by coupons or second-hand furniture. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded, unsure whether to breathe deeply or hold her breath until the evening was over. At 6:30 her ride arrived. The car rolled through streets where people moved like they were late for something important. Evelyn smoothed her dress and watched them through lowered lashes, feeling both invisible and exposed. The dinner venue was tucked behind an iron gate, surrounded by bare trees adorned with lights that glowed like tiny constellations. The building itself was old but restored to a level of elegance that didn't ask for permission. Tall windows spilled warm light onto the snow-kissed courtyard. The driver opened her door again. Right through those doors, Miss Hart. They're expecting you. Expecting her. The notion sat awkwardly in her chest. She stepped inside. The room was lit by chandeliers whose glow softened everything it touched. Tables draped in ivory linen stretched across the floor, each set with crystal glasses and polished silverware. Conversations drifted like warm currents, low, confident, threaded with laughter that sounded expensive. Evelyn felt suddenly small in a way she hadn't since childhood. She tucked her hands together and willed her heartbeat to settle. "Miss Hart." The voice came from behind her, calm, familiar, carrying a quiet gravity. She turned. Daniel stood a few feet away, dressed in a suit that was tailored with the kind of precision that whispered old money and newer obligations. His hair was neatly combed, but a silver streak near his temple caught the light. He didn't smile immediately. Instead, his eyes softened, as if seeing her here mattered more than any announcement or speech he might give tonight. "You came," he said simply. "I said I would," she replied. "You did," he acknowledged, and something in his voice shifted, becoming warmer. "And I'm glad." He offered his arm. She hesitated only long enough to remember that this wasn't her world, and then she accepted. He guided her through the room, past people who greeted him with nods and practiced smiles. Names were murmured around them, introductions she barely registered, partners, board members, individuals with positions so polished they sounded fictional. She caught none of the details, only the tones. Polite, impressed, curious about the woman who walked beside him. They stopped near a quieter corner where a single candle flickered atop a small table. He seated her gently, then took the chair across from her, their distance small enough that she could hear the soft exhale he released once he settled. "I imagine this is overwhelming," he said. "A little," she admitted. "You're doing well, Miss Hart." The voice came from behind her, calm, familiar, carrying a quiet gravity. She turned. Daniel stood a few feet away, dressed in a suit that was tailored with the kind of precision that whispered old money and newer obligations. His hair was neatly combed, but a silver streak near his temple caught the light. He didn't smile immediately. Instead, his eyes softened, as if seeing her here mattered more than any announcement or speech he might give tonight. "You came," he said simply. "I said I would," she replied. "You did," he acknowledged, and something in his voice shifted, becoming warmer. "And I'm glad." He offered his arm. She hesitated only long enough to remember that this wasn't her world, and then she accepted. He guided her through the room, past people who greeted him with nods and practiced smiles. Names were murmured around them, introductions she barely registered, partners, board members, individuals with positions so polished they sounded fictional. She caught none of the details, only the tones. Polite, impressed, curious about the woman who walked beside him. They stopped near a quieter corner where a single candle flickered atop a small table. He seated her gently, then took the chair across from her, their distance small enough that she could hear the soft exhale he released once he settled. "I imagine this is overwhelming," he said. "A little," she admitted. "You're doing well." For a moment, silence held them, warm and fragile. Then he continued, voice lower. "When I arrived at your cabin, I realized something. You weren't just a stranger helping another stranger. You were giving her something I failed to give her for years." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. "What is that?" "A place where she is not a burden." The confession was so quiet she almost missed it. But its impact was immediate. His shoulders, always straight, always composed, softened, and she understood in that instant that this man, who commanded entire companies, didn't know how to carry the one responsibility that mattered most. "I've built her a home," he said. "I've hired the best care. I've given her safety, but I haven't given her space to be herself. Not the version everyone knows. The version she once was." Evelyn shook her head. "You've done more than most sons ever would." "Maybe," he said. But she still ran. And she ran toward something. "Toward you." The idea felt too large for her. "I don't understand," she whispered. His gaze held hers, steady and searching. "I think," he said, "that she saw something in you that reminded her of the woman who saved her once. Or perhaps she saw something she needed for a single night. Dignity. Warmth. Kindness with no strings." Evelyn swallowed hard. "I only did what anyone would do." "No," he said gently. "You did what a rare person does. The words landed softly, but with enough force to make her look down at her hands. She wasn't used to being seen with that kind of clarity. Daniel reached into his jacket then and set something on the table. A small key. Its metal was worn, the engraving faint. She looked at him questioningly. "This," he said, "was found in my mother's coat pocket after she returned this afternoon. She was clutching it when she walked in." "What is it?" Evelyn asked. "A key to the old Whitcomb cabin," he replied. "Your home. From years before the locks were changed." A shiver moved through her, not fear but recognition, as if the story she was walking into had never been about the storm at all, but about something deeper buried in the walls she lived within. "I think she wanted you to have it," he said. "Or perhaps she wanted to say that the past she's been holding on to is now yours too." Evelyn touched the key lightly. It was warm from his hand, cold from its history, carrying a message she couldn't read yet. Before she could speak, Daniel added softly, "There's more. Something I learned this morning that you may want to sit down for." Her pulse quickened. "What is it?" He folded his hands, exhaled once, and met her eyes with a stare. "The Whitcombs didn't just hire my mother," he said. "They left something behind when they sold the cabin. Something no one knew about except them." Her breath caught. He continued, "And according to the documents, it now legally belongs to you." The world seemed to tilt a little. The room around them faded. The key in front of her gleamed faintly, its metal catching the candlelight like a signal. Whatever the next words were, whatever truth he was about to reveal, Evelyn knew they would change the shape of her life as surely as the storm had changed the shape of the valley. And she wasn't ready, but she was listening. For a moment, Evelyn forgot how to breathe. The key lay between them, small and unassuming, yet its presence pressed against the table like a weight waiting to shift something enormous. Daniel watched her quietly, giving her space to absorb his words, but even his stillness felt charged, as if he understood that whatever came next needed care. "What do you mean it belongs to me?" she asked, her voice steady only on the surface. He rested his hands on the table, fingers interlaced, as though preparing to deliver a truth he had been rehearsing all day. "When the Whitcomb family sold the property," he began, "they left a clause in the deed. A sealed addendum to be opened only if certain conditions were met. For years it stayed untouched, a formality no one bothered with. The cabin passed hands once before you, then to you, but the addendum was never triggered." She blinked. "Triggered by what?" "By the return of Margaret Mercer," he said softly. "Or, more specifically, by her presence on that land again." Evelyn stared at him, the words folding into her mind like paper notes she would need time to smooth out. "Are you saying they expected her to come back?" Daniel nodded once, slowly. "The Whitcombs were complicated people. Generous but private. My mother didn't just work for them, she was for a brief time. She helped them through a difficult winter. They cared for her in ways she never spoke about, not even to me." The photograph on her mantel flashed into Evelyn's mind. The laughter. The warmth. The ease. "They believed," he continued, "that she might one day need the house again. That it should be safe for her, no matter what life brought." For a heartbeat, Evelyn felt her pulse echo in her throat. "So they left the cabin to her? To someone," he corrected gently, "who would see her the way they once did. Someone who would open a door without hesitation." She shook her head. "But I didn't know her. I didn't even know the story." "Maybe that's exactly why," he said. "My mother didn't seek out history. She sought out kindness." Evelyn tried to steady herself. "What's in the addendum?" "A letter from the Whitcombs," Daniel replied. "And a portion of their estate. Not the main inheritance, but something significant. Something they wanted connected to the cabin itself." Her lips parted. "Estate." "Yes." He hesitated, choosing his words. "Not money. Land. And something they hid within the property lines. Something only the person living there could access." She stared at him, then at the key. "Why me?" "Because you're the one who let her in," he said quietly. "You're the one who completed the circle." The room seemed to tilt again, not harshly, but with the slow gravity of something monumental settling into place. Daniel continued, his voice low. "This morning after leaving your cabin, I visited the courthouse records office. I requested everything tied to that old deed. The clerk found the addendum sealed inside a file that hadn't been opened in decades. Evelyn swallowed. Have you read it? Yes, he said. And before you panic, no, there's nothing binding you to anything. Nothing burdensome. The witch with generosity. She exhaled shakily. Then what is it? He leaned forward slightly, the candlelight catching the shadows under his eyes. The short version is this. The land behind your cabin, about 12 acres leading into the tree line, was separated from the sale, held in trust, waiting for a person who would meet a certain condition, which was showing kindness, he said simply. Not to the town. Not to a stranger on the street. But to Margaret. Her chest tightened. So last night was the key, he said softly. She returned. You opened your door. The condition was met. She stared at the table, overwhelmed by the impossibility of it. This doesn't feel real. I know, he said. I felt the same reading it. She looked up. Why would they leave land for kindness? Because they believed in legacy, he replied. Not in money or bloodlines, but in acts that ripple. She absorbed his words in silence, the world narrowing to the candle between them. Daniel took a slow breath. There's more. Her pulse quickened. More. The trust included instructions, he said. For whoever lived in the cabin at the time the condition was met. Instructions for finding something the Whitcombs hid there. Her stomach dropped. What kind of something? He met her eyes steady and sure. A box buried beneath the foundation. Inside it, according to the document, is a journal. A family history. Something they wanted preserved, but not through blood, through character. Evelyn forced herself to speak. And they wanted the person who lived there to have it. Yes. Why didn't they give it to Margaret directly? Daniel exhaled, a faint ache in his expression. Because they knew she would never accept it. Because they knew she might forget it. And because they believed that if she ever found her way back there, it would be because Ellen closed her eyes for a brief moment, fighting the swell of emotion that rose like a tide she wasn't prepared to handle. They left you their trust, Daniel said softly. Not because of your name. Because of your heart. When she opened her eyes, he was watching her with a sincerity that made her look away. This is too much, she whispered. I know, he said. I didn't bring you here to overwhelm you. I brought you because you deserve to know the truth. Because the trust legally transfers to you. And because I didn't want you to read those words alone. She bit the inside of her cheek. I'm not sure I can take any of this on. You don't have to take it on today, he said gently. Or ever if you choose not to. But there is something else I need to tell you. Something more personal. She braced herself. What? He leaned back, and for the first time since she met him, he looked almost uncertain. My mother asked about you today. She remembered your face. She said you reminded her of the younger woman in that photo. Evelyn felt her pulse flutter. The one holding the baby? Yes, he said. Mary Whitcomb. She blinked slowly. Why would I remind her of her? Because, he said, voice low and steady, you resemble her. A chill moved through her. That's not possible. It's not exact, he said. But when you stand in the doorway of that cabin, there's something in your posture. Something in the way you tilt your head. My mother mentioned it twice. Evelyn shook her head. But I'm not related to them. No, he acknowledged. Not by blood. But resemblance isn't always about genetics. Sometimes it's about spirit. You saw my mother last night the way Mary saw her decades ago. Without judgment, without hesitation. She tried to ground herself by touching the edge of the table. What exactly are you saying? That the Whitcombs believed their legacy would finally, he replied. And it did. She felt heat in her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. Daniel's voice softened further. There's one more part of the addendum. She lifted her gaze. What part? He inhaled slowly. It names the cabin not as property, but as inheritance. Not financial. Symbolic. And the trust states that the land and the journal go to the keeper of the door. She blinked. The keeper of the door, he finished. The one who opens it without being asked why. The words settled over her like snow, silent, cold, strangely beautiful. She swallowed hard. Why are you telling me all this tonight? Because the box under your foundation needs 2 witnesses to be opened, he said. Someone from your life. And someone from Margaret's. Her breath stilled. 2 witnesses. Yes, he said. And she chose you. The moment she knocked, he paused, then added quietly. And I choose you too. Something inside her tightened, not painfully, but with the unmistakable pull of a story threading itself through hers. What happens now? She asked. Daniel sat straighter, his tone gentling. Now you decide whether you want to open that box, whether you want to see what the Whitcombs entrusted to the future. Silence stretched between them. The city hummed outside the tall windows. The dinner murmurs faded behind the soft glow of the candle. And Evelyn Hart realized that the storm hadn't blown a stranger to her door. It had blown open her life. Daniel, she said finally, her voice barely above a breath. I don't know what I'm meant to do. He leaned forward, his expression unguarded. You don't have to know, he said. Just don't walk away from the truth because it feels bigger than you. Her fingers hovered above the old key. It looked small. It carried a legacy. It waited for her hand. Just as her life drive back to the hotel after dinner passed in a blur. The city lights smeared across the windows like streaks of gold and white, but none of it reached her. Something inside Evelyn had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that happens not from calm but from too many truths trying to settle at once. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed long after midnight, the dress still clinging to her, the old key on the nightstand catching the soft light from the lamp. She picked it up, turned it over, felt the grooves worn by a hand that was not hers. Margaret's hand. Or maybe someone else's years before Evelyn was born. It was strange holding something that had traveled through so many lives and ended up with her. She set it back down and lay on her back, staring at the ceiling. She tried to catalog her thoughts like she cataloged books, but they didn't line up neatly. They spun, collided, scattered. She thought of the Whitcombs and their cabin. She thought of Margaret walking through a storm with nothing but memory guiding her. She thought of the box under her foundation and the instructions written decades ago by people who believed kindness reverberated through time. She thought of Daniel, the way his voice softened when he spoke of his mother, the grief tucked beneath his composure, the quiet gratitude in his eyes that felt too earnest to look at for long. At some point exhaustion claimed her. And in that light, shallow sleep reserved for nights when the world feels shifted off its axis, she dreamed. She saw the cabin not as it was now, but as it once had been. Its wood newer, its roof intact, a lantern glowing on the porch. Snow fell softly around it, the quiet kind untouched by wind. She saw a young woman standing on the steps, her hair dark, her eyes bright, holding a baby whose small hands reached for the light. Mary Whitcomb. And behind her, smiling with the ease of belonging, stood a much younger Margaret. The 2 women turned toward the door. Someone knocked from the inside. She woke with a start, breath caught in her throat. Dawn had just begun to seep through the curtains, pale and hesitant. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. The dream clung to her, vivid and unsettling, as though memory had borrowed her mind for a moment. She dressed and checked out of the hotel before the city had fully stirred. The driver arrived exactly on time, and Evelyn slid into the back seat quietly, grateful for the silence. The drive home felt longer than the drive in. She watched the city recede until the buildings grew sparse and the road curved back into the familiarity of fields, forests, and the mountains rising like old guardians at the edge of everything. When the car turned onto the road toward Maple Hollow, Evelyn felt something inside her unclench. But beneath the relief was another feeling. A pull. As though the cabin wasn't waiting for her, but watching her. The car stopped at the foot of her drive. Would you like me to help with your bag? The driver asked. She shook her head and thanked him, then walked the rest of the way alone, snow crunching beneath her boots. Her breath clouded in front of her. The cold was sharper here but familiar. Honest. She opened the door. The cabin was still and warm, exactly as she'd left it, but it felt different. The walls carried a charged expectancy, as if the moment she stepped in, something shifted into place, a page of a story turning itself whether she was ready or not. She stood in the center of the room and let her eyes rest on the mantel. The photograph waited there, the 3 figures frozen in their moment. Mary's smile. Margaret's laughter. The baby reaching for something just beyond the frame. She stepped closer and touched the edge of the glass. Her reflection hovered faintly over Mary's face, the overlap almost startling. A shiver ran through her, not from fear, but from a sense of being seen by people no longer living. She set her suitcase down, removed her coat, and then picked up the key again, holding it lightly. Its metal was cold now, as if time had settled back into it overnight. Then she noticed something strange. A faint sound, soft, measured, coming from the guest room. She froze. The air shifted around her, charged with possibility and dread both. The memory of Margaret's footsteps in the night rose unbidden. She took one breath, then another, and slowly stepped toward the hallway. The guest room door was closed. She hadn't closed it. Her fingers hovered near the knob. She turned it. The room was dim, lit only by the soft gray of morning. And sitting in the chair beside the freshly made bed was Margaret Mercer. Alive, awake. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, her coat draped over the back of the chair as though she'd been waiting for hours. Her face was calm, eyes clear, expression steady. Evelyn's breath caught in her chest. "Margaret," she whispered. The older woman looked up at her with a soft smile, one that carried both recognition and something deeper. Something waited. "I hoped you would come home," Margaret said. Her voice was steady, stronger than the night of the storm. The tremble was gone. The fog was gone. She looked present. Entirely present. Evelyn stepped inside slowly. "How did you get here?" "I walked," Margaret said simply. "I know the path better than anyone thinks, but Daniel said." "I know what Daniel says," she replied gently. "He thinks I'm fading. And some days I am. But other days," she placed a hand lightly over her heart, "other days the world sharpens again. I hold on to what I can. And I find my way where Evelyn's throat tightened. She sat on the edge of the bed, facing the woman who had slipped through storms and memory alike. "You came back," she whispered. "I had to," Margaret said. "There are things not meant for my son to explain. Things only I can say." Evelyn swallowed hard. "What things?" Margaret took a slow breath, steady and deliberate. "You," she said softly, "need to understand why the Whitcombs chose you." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "I still don't understand any of this." "I know." Margaret's eyes softened. "Which is why I came before your fear could talk you out of learning the truth." Evelyn felt the bed shift slightly as Margaret leaned forward. "Child," she said gently, "do you know why I recognized you the moment you opened the door?" Evelyn shook her head. "Because," Margaret whispered, touching her hand lightly, "you have her eyes." Evelyn's breath caught. "Mary's." "No," Margaret said softly, shaking her head. "Someone else's." She held Evelyn's gaze steady and unwavering. "You look," she said, "exactly like the woman who saved me long before the Whitcombs ever did." Evelyn stared at her, unblinking. "Who?" she asked, voice barely audible. Margaret smiled, a fragile, knowing, heartbreaking smile. "My mother," she said. The air left Evelyn's lungs in a single sharp breath. "My mother," Margaret repeated. "The one I lost in a storm when I was no older than a child." Evelyn's heart pounded. "But I can't." "You can't be her," Margaret finished softly. "I know. But sometimes life repeats its mercies. Sometimes it sends us people who look like memory so we don't lose our way." She squeezed Evelyn's hand with surprising strength. "You didn't just remind me of Mary," she whispered. "You reminded me of the woman who carried me through a winter just like this one. You reminded me of warmth I thought was gone forever." Evelyn felt tears sting the edges of her eyes. "Margaret, I'm not meant for this. Any of this. I just let you in because you have the same soul," Margaret said simply. "And the Whitcombs knew a soul like that when they saw one. See to it." Evelyn stared at her, overwhelmed. "Why me?" she whispered. Margaret's eyes softened, shining with something deep and old. "Because kindness is an inheritance too," she said. "And you are its keeper now." Evelyn's breath faltered. She felt the weight of every moment, the storm, the knock, the note, the key, the photograph, pulling into a single truth. Margaret straightened slowly, her voice turning firm. "There is a box buried under this cabin," she said. "And inside it is a story that ends with you." Evelyn swallowed hard. "I'm not ready." "No one ever is," Margaret murmured. But the past has waited long enough. Evelyn's hands trembled as she held the old woman's gaze. "Will you help me open it?" she whispered. A soft smile pulled at Margaret's lips, her eyes warm with something Evelyn hadn't seen before, recognition. "I've been waiting," Margaret said, "to open it with you." Morning settled slowly over the cabin, filtering through the pale curtains in thin strokes of light. It touched the wooden floorboards first, then the dresser, then finally the chair where Margaret still sat, calm and composed, as though she had never left that room at all. The world outside the window was quiet enough to hear the soft drip of melting snow from the eaves. Inside, everything felt suspended, like breath held between questions. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a long moment, unsure whether she had stepped into reality or a memory borrowed from someone else's life. Margaret looked steadier than she had during the storm. Her eyes were surprisingly bright, her posture upright, hands resting neatly in her lap as though prepared for something important. "Have you eaten?" Evelyn asked softly. Margaret smiled without moving. "Not yet. I wanted to speak to you first." The simplicity of her answer struck Evelyn, and she nodded, moving toward the kitchen. She put water on the stove, warmed the last of yesterday's bread, and poured 2 cups of tea. When she brought the tray back, Margaret accepted the mug with a grateful dip of her head. For a moment they drank in silence. Then Margaret set the cup down and folded her hands, not in nervousness but in intention. "You have questions," she said. "Too many," Evelyn admitted. "We don't need to rush," Margaret replied. "The truth has waited this long. It can wait through tea." Evelyn sat across from her and let the warmth of the cup seep into her palms. Her thoughts churned with the weight of everything Margaret had said the night before. About the Whitcombs, the trust, the box, the land, and the part that struck hardest, the resemblance to her mother. A woman Evelyn had lost young but remembered with a clarity time had never managed to smudge. "I don't understand how I could remind you of someone so specific," Evelyn said quietly. "People look similar sometimes. But the way you spoke, it was like you saw more than just a face." Margaret's gaze softened as though she expected this. "When you've lived long enough," she said gently, "you learn to recognize more than features. You recognize presence. You recognize the way a person stands when the world has bent them but not broken them. You recognize the way they listen, and the way they hold their own loneliness." Evelyn inhaled slowly. "Loneliness. Child," Margaret said, voice tender. "People who offer warmth so freely rarely receive it. They learn to hold their lives quietly. Your mother did. Mary Whitcomb did. And when you opened that door, I saw all of them again." The words settled deep, somewhere behind Evelyn's ribs. Margaret continued softly. "The Whitcombs kept that cabin as a refuge. They believed in giving people a place to rest. When I was young, lost, hungry, they let me in. Just as you did. And sometimes what repeats in life isn't coincidence. It's a calling." Evelyn looked down at her hands. "I'm not sure I can be what they expected. That's the trick," Margaret murmured. "They didn't expect anything. They only trusted that kindness would lead the right soul to the door." She lifted her cup and took a slow sip. Her hand trembled lightly, but there was a steady determination behind it. "We should talk about the land too," she said, "before we go to the box." Evelyn's brow furrowed. "You know about the land?" "Of course," Margaret replied. "The Whitcombs told me long ago. They didn't want the land to fall into the wrong hands. It was sacred to them." "What's on it?" Evelyn asked. Margaret's eyes drifted toward the window as if looking past the present. Trees that were planted with intention. A stream where Mary used to wash linens in the summer. A patch of ground they called the listening field. "Listening," Evelyn repeated. "Yes," Margaret said. "They believed the land had a way of keeping stories. You'll see it when the snow melts. You'll feel it before you understand it." The idea sent a strange shiver through Evelyn, not fear, but recognition of something older than logic. Margaret leaned forward, lowering her voice just slightly. "The Whitcombs wrote about what they hid. They didn't want it found by someone who didn't understand why it mattered." "What did they hide?" Evelyn asked. "A journal," Margaret answered. "But not just Mary's. Generations worth of pages. People who survived winters, heartbreaks, beginnings. Stories that were never meant to be lost." Evelyn's chest tightened. Why bury something like that? Because some truths aren't meant to sit on shelves, Margaret said. They're meant to wait for the one person who can carry them. And they thought that was me? Margaret looked at her, steady and certain. No. I think life chose you. The Whitcombs only made space. Evelyn let out a slow breath, as if the air itself was heavy. Margaret reached them and took Evelyn's hand, curling her old thin fingers around it. I need you to hear something clearly, Margaret said. You don't owe me. You don't owe my son. You don't owe the Whitcombs. You don't even owe the past. Then why am I part of this? Evelyn whispered. Because you answered a knock, Margaret replied. And everything in this world is built on answers. You gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time, dignity. That is not a small gift. Evelyn swallowed, eyes stinging. I just wanted you to be warm. You did more than that, Margaret said softly. You warmed a memory. And in doing so, you opened a path I thought was closed forever. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the truth wash through her like slow-moving water. When she opened them again, Margaret was still watching her with that same steady patience. Do you have the key? Margaret asked. Evelyn nodded and slipped it from her pocket. It rested in her palm, light and familiar now. It won't open a door, Margaret whispered. It will open the ground. Evelyn's breath caught. The ground. Yes, Margaret said, a faint smile pulling at her lips. Come. The foundation won't reveal itself unless both witnesses are present. I wasn't sure how I'd get here this morning, but here we are. She stood slowly, steadying herself on the arm of the chair. Evelyn watched her carefully, rising to support her if needed, but Margaret lifted a hand, stopping her. I'm not fragile, she said gently. Just old. There's a difference. They moved together into the living room. Margaret's steps were slow but sure. The snow outside reflected against the windows, casting the room in soft white light. As they crossed the cabin's center, Evelyn felt something subtle shift. A quiet hum beneath the floorboards, a sense of presence in the wood. It was faint, almost imagined, but Margaret paused too. You feel it? I think so, Evelyn murmured. It's waiting, Margaret said. It has been for years. They stopped near the fireplace. The cabin's heart. Margaret nodded toward the stone hearth. There. Beneath that, Evelyn stared at the ground, pulse quickening. The box is under the fireplace? Yes, Margaret said. The Whitcombs believe that a home's truth sits closest to its fire. Evelyn's mouth went dry. How do we open it? Margaret gestured to the key. Place it on the stone. Evelyn hesitated, then knelt and gently set the key on the middle slab. Nothing happened. She glanced back at Margaret. Touch it, Margaret said. Evelyn placed her fingertips on the key. The stone beneath it warmed, faintly at first, then with a slow, deliberate pulse, like a heartbeat long dormant waking beneath her hand. Evelyn gasped. The slab shifted. Just slightly. A hairline crack formed along its edge, spreading, widening, until the shape of a small square door revealed itself in the hearthstone. Evelyn looked up at Margaret in shock. The older woman nodded once, her expression calm, as though everything was unfolding exactly as it always meant to. Now, Margaret whispered. Lift it. Evelyn's breath trembled. She slid her fingers into the crease, pulled gently, and the stone rose light as a wooden lid. Beneath it lay darkness. And within that darkness, something wrapped in cloth. Evelyn reached in, her hands shaking, and lifted the object. A box. Wooden. Old. Carved with symbols she didn't recognize. Her breath hollowed out of her chest. Margaret stepped closer, her voice barely audible. That, she said, is the Whitcombs' last story. Evelyn held the box against her chest, feeling its weight, not heavy but full. Margaret rested her hand over Evelyn's heart. And now, she whispered, it is yours, Mom's, as if the years beneath the hearth had preserved something alive inside it. Evelyn stood there for a long moment, the wood pressed to her chest, breathing slowly as the truth of what she held settled into her bones. Margaret watched her with a patient, knowing calm, the kind of stillness that comes from having waited a lifetime for a moment to finally arrive. Come, Margaret said softly. Set it on the table. Evelyn walked to the dining table and placed the box at its center. The carving seemed deeper in the morning light, patterns shaped like winding branches, small stars, and old runic curves that whispered of hands that honored time. She brushed her fingers over the lid, tracing their grooves. The wood responded with a faint hum, or maybe her heart did. She couldn't tell. Margaret remained standing behind her, one hand loosely gripping the back of a chair, the other pressed gently against her hip for balance. She didn't sit. It seemed she didn't want to be lower than the truth she had carried for decades. "Open it," Margaret whispered. Evelyn's fingers hovered over the latch. It wasn't locked, just held shut by a small brass hook. She hesitated, not out of fear but reverence. She had held old books before, touched fragile pages meant to be preserved. But this felt different. This felt like a story that had been waiting specifically for her hands. She lifted the latch. The lid creaked as it rose, releasing a breath of air that smelled faintly of cedar and something older, something like time folded neatly into paper. Inside was a bundle wrapped in linen, tied with twine that had faded into a soft gray. Beneath it lay something heavier, wrapped in an oilcloth that had darkened with age. She removed the linen bundle first and set it gently aside, then lifted the larger package. It made a soft shifting sound, like loose pages adjusting inside. "Which one first?" she asked without looking up. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. "The linen. That's the heart. That's the heart." Evelyn untied the twine. The cloth fell away. Inside was a journal. Its cover was leather worn, the edges softened. The spine had cracking lines that spoke of hands turning it often, tucking it away, bringing it back out, writing long after midnight. Evelyn opened it. The first page held only one sentence, written in an elegant script. "For the one who opens the door, kindness keeps the mind alive. If this journal survives, let it survive to honor that." Her vision blurred. She blinked hard and kept reading. The journal continued with entries written in small, steady script, stories of winters survived, of summers working fields by hand, of moments of heartbreak and redemption stitched into ordinary days. Each page carried a voice that felt both fragile and strong, a woman determined not to let her life disappear into silence. When Evelyn reached the 5th page, Margaret touched her shoulder lightly. "You should see the next part," she murmured. "It isn't just my mother." Evelyn turned the pages slowly. The handwriting changed, thicker strokes, someone who pressed harder with the pen. The title at the top of the new page read, "Mary Whitcomb, 1963. Evelyn felt a strange pull inside her, a kinship she couldn't explain. She looked toward the photograph on the mantel, the young woman holding the baby, her smile, her presence. Evelyn had never known her, yet something in the pages tugged at her as if they'd met in another truth. She read Mary's words. The cabin was quiet today. Snow covered the windows until afternoon. Margaret laughed when the wind knocked the kettle off the counter. She said the house was testing us. I think the house is preparing us instead. Preparing us to remember things no one else will. This place chooses its keepers. Evelyn's throat tightened. Mary's entry continued. "I've hidden this journal because stories are more loyal than blood. One day someone will need these pages. Someone who understands that a door is not wood or hinges but willingness." Again that word. Willingness. Margaret whispered. Mary believed the cabin had its own way of knowing when to hold someone and when to guide them out. Evelyn turned another page. Mary's entries grew more personal. Quiet triumphs, losses, small joys. The rhythm of a life lived with intention. Then another handwriting appeared. This one softer, almost shy. A later Whitcomb generation. Notes about local droughts. About keeping bees. About the creek that fed the listening field. People had added their threads to the journal over decades. This wasn't a story. It was a tapestry. Evelyn reached the last written entry, a Whitcomb grandson in 1999, handwriting smooth and thoughtful. "This journal is not ours anymore. It belongs to whoever sees the world the way this house sees its people. Whoever receives this box will carry us forward. Not our name. Our character. Leave it to the keeper of the door." Evelyn's hand shook. She looked up at Margaret. The older woman's eyes were shining. "That's you," Margaret whispered. A long breath escaped Evelyn. "I just opened my door." "You did," Margaret said. And that small act made room for the entire past to reach its next keeper. For a moment silence stretched between them, not empty but full of something reverent. Evelyn reached for the oilcloth bundle next. "What's this?" she asked. "Something Mary left for whoever carried her story next." Margaret replied. Evelyn unfolded the fabric. Inside were two items: a small tin box and a folded piece of paper sealed with drying wax, marked only with a single initial, M. Evelyn opened the tin first. Inside lay a silver locket, delicate, oval, its front engraved with a starburst pattern. She turned it over her chest. On the back, "To the one who remembers us." She opened it. Inside was a tiny faded photograph of Margaret as a child, bundled in winter clothes, cheeks flushed from cold and joy. Next to it, on the other side of the locket, was a blank space, a place for another photo. Evelyn closed the locket gently, overwhelmed. She looked at the sealed letter. "Should I?" she began. "Yes," Margaret said. "She wrote that for you." Evelyn broke the wax. The paper inside was fragile, edges yellowed. Mary's handwriting filled the page in warm slanted lines. "If you are reading this, then the cabin has chosen you. Do not fear that truth. The world will try to tell you legacy is measured in name or wealth. It isn't. Legacy is carried by those who keep their doors open when storms arrive. You do not know me, but I know you. I always believed someone like you would find their way to this house. Take what is ours and make it yours. Protect what must be kept. Share what must be given. And remember this one thing above all. Kindness survives longer than the people who offer it. The land is yours now. The stories are yours. And if you ever feel alone in this task, look toward the listening field. The ground there still hears us." Signed only with Mary. Evelyn folded the letter slowly, pressing her hand against the paper as though anchoring herself to its truth. Her voice trembled. "I don't know how to carry all this." Margaret stepped closer, placing one gentle hand against Evelyn's cheek. "You already are," she whispered. "Every moment you chose compassion, you carried it. This box doesn't give you a burden. It reveals who you already were." A tear slipped down Evelyn's face. She didn't brush it away. Margaret looked toward the window, where soft flakes had started to fall again, drifting in slow spirals. "It's time to take the journal outside," Margaret said. "To the list." Evelyn blinked. "Now?" "Yes," Margaret said. "The first step after receiving a story is letting the land hear you accept it." Evelyn closed the box gently and held the journal to her chest. Margaret slipped her arm through Evelyn's. Together, with the old key in Evelyn's pocket and the weight of generations in her hands, they stepped into the cold. The snow fell lightly now, not a storm but a soft blessing, as they walked toward the field behind the cabin, the land waiting for the next voice in a story older than both of them. And somewhere behind them, in the warmth of the cabin, the hearthstone settled back into place with a quiet certainty. A new keeper had been chosen. The cold air wrapped around them the moment they stepped outside, but it didn't feel harsh. It felt clean, crisp, as if the land itself had taken a slow breath the night before and was now exhaling, waiting for them to arrive. Evelyn tightened her scarf and held the journal close to her chest while Margaret moved beside her with quiet determination, her steps slow but grounded, each footfall guided not by sight but by memory. The snow in the backyard had settled into an even sheet, untouched since the storm. The surface gleamed under the early daylight, reflecting silver against the sky. A faint path wove itself through the snow, a narrow line that led toward the tree line. Evelyn hadn't made it. Margaret hadn't either. Yet there it was, worn into the snow like footsteps the land already expected. Margaret pointed toward it. "The path remembers." Evelyn swallowed hard. "Remembers what?" "Everyone who ever walked it to speak their truth," Margaret whispered. They followed it, the snow crunching beneath their boots. Each step seemed to deepen the silence, shaping it into something sacred. The trees at the edge of the yard stood tall, their branches heavy with white, bending in gentle arcs as if bowing. Beyond them, the listening field opened like a quiet revelation. It wasn't large, only a wide stretch of land framed by trees, its snow unbroken, its center marked by a gentle dip in the earth where the Whitcombs once gathered. A space where the family used to stand in silence and listen to the world breathe. Evelyn had always thought it was simply part of the landscape behind the cabin, nothing more than a clearing. But now, stepping into it, she felt a pull beneath her feet, as though the ground held stories it waited for someone to claim. Margaret paused at the edge, her breath steady. "This is where Mary came when she didn't know how to keep going. This is where my mother stood after losing me for the first time." This is where the Whitcombs wrote their last letters before burying them under the hearth. Evelyn looked across the field. The snow-covered grass swayed slowly in the wind, whispering along the surface. It felt like standing inside a breath pause between heartbeats. "What do we do?" Evelyn asked. Margaret nodded toward the center. "You speak." "Speak," Evelyn repeated. "Yes," Margaret said softly. "Legacy listens. So does the land." Evelyn hesitated, gripping the journal tightly. "I don't know what to say." Margaret guided her a few steps forward. "Say whatever truth sits inside your chest. The first truth. The one you've carried quietly." Evelyn stared down at the journal. The leather cover caught the light, the edges worn smooth by decades of hands. She had read only fragments, yet it already felt like she was holding a heartbeat. She stepped deeper into the field, snow brushing against her boots. She stopped in the center, facing the trees, the mountains, the cabin behind her. Breath clouded in front of her, disappearing into the air as quickly as it came. Margaret remained near the tree-line, watching her with the calm patience of someone who wasn't just witnessing a moment but remembering her own. Evelyn closed her eyes. The wind shifted, brushing lightly against her cheek, as though leaning close to hear. She took a breath that trembled at the edges. And then she spoke. "I never knew I was waiting for anything," she said softly. "I didn't think my life was meant to hold anyone else's story. I thought the cabin was simply a place to hide from the world, a place to heal in silence." The trees shifted slightly, the branches murmuring in the breeze. "I've spent so many years trying to stay small," she continued, "trying to take up as little space as I could. Maybe I thought that if I didn't ask for anything, I wouldn't be a burden. Maybe I learned to live quietly so no one would ever knock on my door expecting more than I could give." A tear escaped, warm against the cold air. "But then a stranger knocked," she whispered. "And I think she knocked on the door I closed in myself years ago. I didn't know how much I needed that knock until the moment I opened it." Margaret bowed her head slightly, as though honoring the truth. Evelyn opened the journal, letting the pages fall where they wanted. The wind tugged at them gently, revealing an entry from Mary she hadn't seen before. It read, "When storms come, we learn who we are. Not by the way we survive, but by the doors we open for others." Her breath caught. She pressed her hand to the page. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to carry all of this," she admitted softly. "But I know I can no longer pretend that my life is meant to be small." The field fell still, as though listening deeper. "I accept this story," she whispered. "Not because I think I deserve it, but because it found me. And because someone trusted me without ever knowing my name." Her body felt lighter, as though speaking the words lifted a heaviness she had worn for years. She closed the journal gently and held it against her heart. A soft gust of wind swept across the field, circling her once, a gentle sweeping arc, stirring the snow around her in a quiet dance. It wasn't strong. It wasn't dramatic. It was a touch, a response. Margaret stepped forward, her movements slow but purposeful. She reached her side and placed one hand over the journal, her fingers resting on the leather cover with trembling reverence. "It heard you," she whispered. Evelyn exhaled shakily. "What happens now?" Margaret turned toward the cabin, her gaze steady. "Now you write." Evelyn blinked. "Me?" Margaret nodded. "Every keeper adds a page. It's tradition. Mary did. The generations after her did. And now so will you." Evelyn's breath stilled. "What do I write?" "Your truth," Margaret said simply. "The one you just spoke. The one you've lived. The one that brought you to that door last night." Evelyn looked down at the journal again. The thought of writing in something so sacred terrified her, yet the idea of not writing felt more wrong. Margaret touched her arm gently. "You're not adding to their story. You're continuing it." Snow fell softly around them. The listening field felt warmer, as if the land had swallowed her words and settled them safely into its roots. They walked back to the cabin slowly, the journal held between them like a shared heartbeat. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them instantly. Evelyn set the journal on the table, reached for a pen and sat down. Her hand trembled, but not from fear. From the weight of meaning. She flipped to the back, to the blank page reserved for the next voice. Margaret sat across from her, watching with a soft pride that didn't need words. Evelyn lowered the pen to the page. The first stroke of ink felt like stepping across a threshold she didn't know existed until she crossed it. She wrote her name. Then she wrote her date. Then she wrote the truth she had spoken in the field, letting her heart shape the words as they came, unpolished, unfiltered, honest. Margaret watched her finish, tears glistening in the corners of her eyes. Margaret reached across and closed the journal gently. "It's done," she whispered. "You're part of us now." The room seemed to breathe with them. Evelyn looked at the locket, the letter, the box. "What about Daniel?" she asked softly. Margaret's expression softened in a way that carried decades of love and regret. "He will come. He always does when the truth calls him." "What will I tell him?" "Everything," Margaret said. "But you'll know the right words when the moment arrives." A knock echoed suddenly from the front door, gentle, unsure, but familiar. Evelyn and Margaret exchanged a glance. Margaret's smile widened. "He's early," she whispered. Evelyn's heart quickened. She rose slowly, journal still warm from her touch, and walked toward the door. The snow shimmered through the window. The knock came again. This time she opened it without hesitation. Daniel stood on the porch with snow caught in his hair, his breath curling into the cold morning air. His eyes found hers the second the door opened. No introduction. No polite greeting. Just a quiet searching, as if he needed to confirm she was really there. "Evelyn," he said, voice low. Something in the way he said her name, not rushed, not formal, almost relieved, softened the tension inside her. She stepped aside and he entered, brushing snow from his coat. The warmth of the cabin closed around them, settling like a gentle hand on their shoulders. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her posture regal despite her age, her hands wrapped around her cooled cup of tea. When Daniel saw her, something raw flashed across his face. Surprise, relief, guilt, gratitude, all woven together. "Mother," he breathed. She smiled at him, a small smile but real. "I told you I'd find my way." Daniel crossed the room and knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "You shouldn't be here alone. You could've." "I wasn't alone," Margaret interrupted this time. Her gaze shifted to Evelyn. Daniel followed it. "What happened?" he asked, looking between them. "What changed?" Margaret rested her palm on his cheek. "I remembered something worth walking toward." The words hung in the air, tender, heavy, a truth that carried both love and apology. Daniel swallowed hard, then slowly rose, turning to Evelyn. "Did she find you?" "Again. She came early this morning," Evelyn said. "She knew what needed to be done." He frowned, confused. "Needed?" Margaret gestured toward the table. "Show him." Evelyn walked back, lifted the wooden box gently, and carried it to the center of the room. Daniel stared at it, brows knitted. "What is that?" "The Whitcomb's legacy," Margaret answered. "The part they left behind for the keeper of the door." Daniel looked toward Evelyn, surprise flickering across his features. "You found the box?" "She opened it," Margaret corrected. "Because it wasn't meant for me. Or for you." Daniel's confusion deepened, but there was something else in his expression, something softer, as if a truth he hadn't yet understood was aligning in the space between them. Evelyn set the journal on the table. Daniel reached for it hesitantly, touching the leather as though afraid it would crumble. When he opened the first page and saw the words, "For the one who opens the door," his breath caught. He turned the next page, saw the date, saw the handwriting. His voice fell to a whisper. This is my grandmother's." Margaret nodded. She wrote what she wanted remembered. And Mary added her own part. And the generations after. Daniel flipped through slowly, his hand trembling. "You read all of this?" "Not all," Evelyn said quietly. "Not yet." "How did you find it?" he asked. She looked at Margaret. "She found me," Evelyn said simply. "And the kind to absorb everything at once. I don't understand how any of this is real." "Because you never knew the whole story," Margaret said. "You grew up with the edges. The easy parts. Not the truth that lived beneath the floorboards." Daniel rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I spent my whole life thinking the Whitcombs left behind land and old photographs and winter tales. I never imagined they left." He looked at the journal again. "This." Margaret's voice softened. "You were never meant to carry it. You already carry me." A long breath escaped him. He looked at Evelyn not with confusion now, but with something steadier, awe maybe, or recognition. "How do you fit into this?" he asked softly. Evelyn held his gaze. "I didn't choose to. The cabin chose. Or the land did. Or your mother did. Maybe all three." Margaret nodded. "Legacy is not passed by blood alone. Sometimes it finds the person who keeps the world gentle." Daniel looked back at the journal, then at the hearth, then at Evelyn again. "I want you to show me everything," he said. "All of it. From the moment she knocked." Evelyn nodded slowly. "I will." Margaret shifted in her chair, her voice firmer than before. "But first, Daniel, you need to accept something." He turned to her. "What?" "That I'm not lost," she said. "Not entirely. Not yet. I may fade, but I am not gone. And your fear can't be the only voice guiding the rest of my story." Daniel's jaw tightened, emotion rising like a tide he couldn't hold back. "I know. I don't know how to let go without losing you." Margaret cupped his cheek. "You don't lose me by letting me live." Silence filled the room, full of years they both avoided speaking plainly. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, then pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture of surrender, of love, of understanding he hadn't been ready for until the room to breathe in the truth between them. After a long moment, Margaret released Daniel and looked toward the wooden box again. "Bring it closer," she said. Daniel lifted the box and placed it in her lap. Margaret traced the carvings with her fingertips, reverent. "I've been waiting to see this open for longer than you've been alive," she murmured. "There's more inside?" Evelyn asked. Margaret nodded. Something Mary hid beneath the journal. Daniel looked stunned. "Why didn't she tell anyone?" "Because this was never meant for us," Margaret said. "Only for the keeper." She lifted the journal gently, revealing a false bottom, a wooden panel that had seemed like part of the box until now. Margaret pushed lightly on the corners. The panel clicked. Daniel inhaled sharply. "You're kidding me," he whispered. Margaret lifted the panel. Beneath it lay 3 folded items. A deed sealed with the Whitcomb crest. A second letter addressed simply, "To the woman after Mary." And a small envelope, yellowed with age, marked, "For Evelyn." Her breath faltered. Daniel's head snapped toward her. "For you? How?" Margaret smiled softly. "Some things are written long before we understand them." Hands shaking, Evelyn reached for the envelope. It felt impossibly light. Her name, her real name, written in script that should not have existed before she was born. "How is this possible?" she whispered. Margaret rested her hand over Evelyn's. "Mary believed the cabin would bring the right woman when the world needed her. She wrote that letter without knowing your face, but knowing your spirit." Daniel stared at Evelyn like he was seeing her for the first time. "Open it," Margaret said. Evelyn slowly lifted the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper. One sentence, written in steady, unwavering handwriting. "Thank you for being exactly who you are. M." The simple broke. Not into pieces but open. The weight she had carried for years, the loneliness, the smallness she had accepted as her life, all of it cracked, not painfully but like ice thawing in spring. Daniel stepped forward, placing a hand gently on the table. "Evelyn," he said softly, "you belong here. In this story. With us." Margaret nodded. "Yes, she does." Evelyn wiped her tears with the back of her hand, breath shaking. "I don't know what comes next," she whispered. Margaret smiled. "That's the beauty. You're not meant to know. You're meant to live it." Daniel stepped closer, his voice warm. "We'll figure it out together." Evelyn looked at the journal, the letter, the box, the land beyond the window, and at the 2 people whose lives had woven into hers so unexpectedly. And she felt it, not certainty, not clarity, but belonging, the kind she had never known she needed. Margaret placed the journal in Evelyn's hands once more. "This story never ends," she said gently. "It only changes keepers." Evelyn closed the journal to her chest. Outside, the snowfall softened into a quiet drift, as though the sky itself was settling into peace. Daniel stood beside her. Margaret, across from them, folded her hands with the contentment of someone who had finally delivered a truth long overdue. And in the warm glow of that small, humble cabin, Evelyn understood something she had missed her entire life. She had not been chosen by accident. She had been chosen by kindness. And now she was its keeper. A stranger knocked during the blizzard. She let her in. At dawn, a millionaire revealed the truth. But in the end, it wasn't wealth, legacy, or land that changed Evelyn's life. It was a single night of mercy. A door opened in a storm. A kindness that echoed through generations. When she closed the journal and stepped into the soft winter light, she finally understood this comes had guarded all along. Kindness lives longer than the people who offer it. And she was its keeper now.